Hello, everyone. It's Darren DeVivo with you, and welcome to Things We Said Today. It's a show all about the Beatles, anything and everything about the Beatles, together or apart, Beatle-related topics, lots of guests. We get come to you every other week with a new show, give or take, sometimes maybe every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But we're here now, and that's all that matters. I guess now would be the perfect time for me to try to do this as briefly as possible. Normally, I would be saying, hey, WFUV Radio New York City. Some of you may have heard my announcement on Talk More Talk. The days at WFUV Radio are now over, unfortunately. 41 years on the radio at WFUV, started in 1984. It came to an end because of the cuts that have been made to funding of public broadcasting. Government funding was cut, and public broadcasting outlets, TV, radio, are reeling now. And unfortunately, that hit very close to home. 3 weeks ago, I was shown the door, and I said, I don't like that door. And they showed me another one, and I had to take that one. I couldn't, And so, unfortunately, at the moment, I am no longer at WFUV, but things are brewing, and hopefully soon I'll be doing my thing somewhere else, maybe a different thing, maybe many things. But I'm with you here now, and that's all that matters. And enough on me. I'm joined here on Things We Said Today by two good friends of mine. Um, he is in the process of co-writing the definitive history of Paul McCartney. The McCartney Legacy Volume 1 and Volume 2 have been published. They are behind him, the red and blue books. And coming, I guess maybe we'll be talking about a Volume 3 at this time next year, perhaps. Allan Kozinn's with us, and Allan, of course, has also written for many publications through the years, decades as a writer and a critic and an author. And you could still read his work in a variety of publications like the Wall Street Journal. Highlights for Kids, you still do that anymore? Popular Mechanics, that was. Where today might you be published now, and not just the Wall Street Journal?
Um, well, I haven't been doing an awful lot lately because I've been getting stuff together for Volume 3. But the next thing that I have coming up is in the Wall Street Journal, is in a
Okay.
review of the Lennon box, the Power
Okay.
People. So that should be coming up within the next couple of weeks.
All right. Well, that's Allan Kozinn. And Allan, it's great to talk to you. Great to see you again. And of course, Ken Michaels. Ken Michaels. He's a Beatles legend, been broadcasting um, uh, over 40 years. And most of what he's been doing in broadcasting world is Beatle related, and currently hosts Every Little Thing, syndicated Beatles radio program, and also is the host of Ken Michaels Radio, which is a YouTube channel packed with interviews galore. And everything's laid out and explained on his website. The website's kenmichaelsradio.com or just kenmichaels.com. Okay,
KenMichaelsRadio.com.
Ken, that's the website as well. And you also know Ken from hosting Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video podcast with me and Kid O'Toole, and here on Things We Said Today. How are you, Ken?
I'm great. I never leave this room.
Yeah, but you want to leave occasionally. You have been locked in there by your
Yeah, I
wife
have
is.
to once in a while.
She slides flat stakes underneath the door. Um, but anyway, we got a good show for you today. But before we get started, Ken's got the Beatles news.
Okay. Thank you, Darren. By the way, Alan does write for a Beatle fan. Should
Oh,
always
that's
mention
right.
that.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I always, when I do that, I'm always going to forget something, which is good. This is a good time for me now because I'm not doing anything, so there's nothing to remember at the moment. But anyway.
Okay. First of all, I'm sure everyone knows about this, but Paul McCartney gave a more intimate concert at the Santa Barbara Bowl last Friday. That's September 26th. And a big surprise came from his opening number. For the first time ever, he performed a full version of the Beatles' classic Help. Paul did include Help as part of a medley that was a tribute to John Lennon combining it with Strawberry Fields Forever and Give Peace a Chance. And that was at the Liverpool dock. And once in a while, I may be leaving the screen, but I'll come right back, I promise.
It's magic.
Paul, Paul also performed Coming Up for the first time in quite a while. This wasn't a complete show with the band. He did 26 songs instead of the usual, does around 35 most of the time. Paul is still doing the songs now and then, and I've got a feeling as a virtual duet with John. Also in McCartney news, a tour diary on his three concerts at the Bowery Ballroom in New York City this past February was made and shared on social media, showing fans waiting in line and witnessing the concert inside. Makes you wonder if there's some documentary in the works. Now, before we started recording this show, Alan was telling us he had some new information regarding the Beatles anthology, the new video for the Beatles anthology. So, want to
Right.
share that with us?
So far, all we had heard was that there was going to be a ninth episode, and the ninth episode will be mainly about the recordings that they did in, '95 or so. Getting together to do the, Real Love and Free as a Bird and Now and Then. But what we hadn't heard was that the original episodes are being sort of re-edited in a way. I think what I've heard is that they felt that the original anthology focused heavily on the Beatles in concert and on their promo clips, and felt that the studio sessions were given short shrift. So they've added material about the studio sessions to sort of balance that out a bit better. Not sure what kind of footage they have of studio sessions, but maybe there is more interview material about the studio sessions that they've added. But so, the main thing is that it won't be the same anthology that we've seen before, first on TV, then on, home video. It'll be yet a third version. Um, which means, of course, that desktop bootleggers will be taking all the available versions, perhaps even the original anthology director's cut that was a bootleg originally that had unreleased stuff that, from an early cut, and maybe making a super cut of everything. That's almost inevitable. So anyway, that's the news about anthology.
Well, that's exciting to hear, and it makes me really want them to release a DVD Blu-ray of the new version.
Hmm.
So you keep hearing about Disney not caring about physical product anymore. There certainly was a long delay for Get Back to come out. So let's hope and pray that they'll do something
Hmm.
with the new, somewhat newer Beatles anthology. All right. There was a new video that was made for Sunday Bloody Sunday, which is now on YouTube. It's a longer version of the song. It's around 7 minutes long. It doesn't have footage of John and Yoko and Elephant's Memory. It's basically all footage from wars from the past, from the Vietnam War on, with statistics thrown at you, like how many people died, what the cost was for each war. Very effective. And it even says at the very end how many people died from guns in the United States since John's death.
Hmm.
Very effective there. So check that out. Sunday Bloody Sunday. Eric Clapton's 1989 album, Journeyman, is coming out in a deluxe edition, and it will have as a bonus track That Kind of Woman. That was a song that George gave to Eric, one of four songs he gave to Eric for Journeyman. Eric only put one of those songs on the album, originally called Run So Far, and George's version ended up on Brainwashed of Run So Far. That Kind of Woman was released, the Eric Clapton version. It ended up on the Nobody's Child charity album for the Romanian Angel Appeal, but this is the first time that it's going to be on an actual Eric Clapton album in the deluxe version for Journeyman. and that's coming out on November 21st. Thanks to Martin Quibell for that. The new autobiography from Denny Sywell, The Best and Worst of Times, has just been released. We've all gotten our copies right here. We should be speaking with him very soon about his times with Paul and his career. You
It
know,
looks like he's in the room with me.
he's
I
looking
got
on.
a little mini Denny with me. How are you, Denny? I'm good. I'm good, Darren.
He'll be on our show soon, and he'll also be appearing on Talk More Talk, probably within the next few weeks, we think. There's a new documentary on the Beatles, which drops on October the 7th, called Love Letter to the Beatles. It's about how the Beatles are still turning on new fans all over the world and how the group has impacted their lives. It'll be streamed on most streaming services, including Amazon Prime, Peacock, Fandango, Tubi, and Flex, and others. And there are plans to put it out on DVD Blu-ray, though we don't have a release date for that yet. Now, how's this for a Beatles book with an angle that really hasn't been approached before? The book's called Capital Gains, Exposing the Conflict Between the Beatles and the Record Label That Made Them, by Andrew Cook. The book explores the struggles between Brian Epstein, the Beatles, and Capitol Records and what went on behind the scenes, including why the label was reluctant to signing them in 1963 while they were breaking big in the UK, and Capitol's unfavorable view of the British music industry and how they set out to remix UK master tapes and create their own albums. Also, how Epstein often struggled to balance Capitol's commercial decisions against the Beatles' own demands, and the book explores the efforts made to protect the Beatles' image as they were caught up in the whirlwind of global success. This book is due for release October 23rd in the UK and next February in the US. Many thanks to John Bazzini for that information. And here's a book that we knew it had to happen at some point. It's called From Me to You, Life and Love with the Beatles and Beyond by Thelma McGough, the former Thelma Pickles. Thelma Pickles is sometimes written up as John's first girlfriend, or she was one of his first. And her long-awaited book is coming out. It'll be out on hardcover April 23rd next year. As I said in Talk More Talk, this does scare me because it may force Paul to delay his new album. He doesn't want to compete with Thelma. I mean, Thelma Pickles, the book is in high demand, I'm sure. Be great to have her on this show. She's got to be in the same age ballpark as John. And that would be 85.
Hmm.
There are so many jokes I want to make right now, but I'm holding back.
Well, you're in a pickle.
Exactly.
Alan G. Parker, the director of the John Lennon documentary Borrowed Time, he was a guest on our show a few months ago, um, mentioned a DVD Blu-ray coming out soon. Since it's been a few months since that interview, I wrote to him asking about it, and he said the company that bought the film for DVD Blu-ray are doing a cinema presentation in New York City on December 8th, 45 years since John's death. The physical releases will be later that week. So if you've been waiting for a release for Borrowed Time, and there is a director's cut of that, which is supposed to be, I think, an hour and a half longer than the version that we've seen. That's your answer for that so far. Julian News, the video for his song Because has just come out. It's strictly a black and white performance video of him with the musicians on the song. His new EP with 4 songs comes out October 24th. These are actually 4 older songs from the 80s and 90s that didn't make it onto Julian's albums. They've been cleaned up and in some cases with musical parts added. Um, New cover versions. The band POD have just released their cover version of the Beatles song Don't Let Me Down. Thanks to Scott O'Rourke for that. And there's a new cover of Paul McCartney's instrumental, Mama Miss America, by the Pepper Gang, as it's being used in the Netflix series called Wayward. I'm not sure if the song is available physically, but you can find it on Spotify under the name of the show, Wayward. Many thanks to one of our listeners, Elliot Marks, for that. Some big events happening. Jeff Slate and Friends will be doing a John Lennon birthday bash for his birthday. The concert is October 5th at Cafe Wa, the very famous place in New York City, at 6:30 p.m. Billy J. Kramer, The Circle, and 60s Thunder, an all 60s band, all performing together. Really cool to have Billy J. Kramer and The Circle on the same bill. They will be at the Regent Theater in Arlington, Massachusetts on November the 16th. As we know from our last show, the annual John Lennon tribute show from Theater Within happens December the 12th at Town Hall in New York City. There'll be a Real Love Award given to the legend, Judy Collins, and other legends will be there as well, performing, including Graham Nash and Jimmy Webb, and Suzanne Vega will be there too. You need more information about that concert, go to lennontribute.org. Check out our recent interview with Joe Raiola right here on Things We Said Today, telling you all about the history of the Lennon Tribute Show. There will also be an Everything Fab 4 festival, and it takes note of the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' Rubber Soul album. It happens over 3 days, November 6th, 7th, and 8th, at the Berkeley Oceanfront Hotel in Asbury Park. There will be panel discussions all 3 days. And Darren and I and Kid O'Toole from Talk More Talk will be doing a panel on the Friday, November the 7th at 9 a.m. There'll be special guests. Yes, you'll have to get up that early, Darren. There'll be special guests throughout those 3 days, including Max Weinberg, The Weaklings, Jamie Bernstein, Nellie McKay, Black
Hi,
Rabbit. What's that?
Nellie Mackay.
Nellie McKay. I'm sorry.
Is it? I don't apologize.
Okay, well, you're up on all the new artists.
I'm hip. I'm happy.
That's right. You're hot. Bob Santelli, who is the director of the Bruce Springsteen Archives. Rob Sheffield will be there, and the group Magical Mystery Girls. And a portion of the proceeds will go to the Light of Day Foundation. If you need more information about that, go to ef4fest.com. And one last thing, we sent out a happy birthday wish. Yesterday, Stephen Friedland celebrated his 85th birthday, better known as Brute Force, the guy who gave us King of Pho.
Also known as
I
the
get the
fuck king.
feeling. I get the feeling with all the problems with the one song from John Lennon that was omitted from this upcoming box set. I think Brute Force would have a similar problem if they tried to reissue his song.
Or they replaced John's song with King of Pho. I don't
Boy, that would turn a lot of heads, wouldn't it?
know.
So that's the news.
That's some good news there, Ken. Thank you, Ken. And now on to our topic, which is a kind of a debate that we'll have over George Harrison during his time in the Beatles. Was George Harrison, as I kind of can't get this expression out of my head when describing the show, was George dissed as a Beatle? Having, of course, to share the spotlight with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who, you don't need me to explain the whole thing to you. Do we know that George was hidden in the shadows there? But was he dismissed? Was he marginalized at all within the band? Was it intentional? Was it accidental? Is it something that was we're making a big deal out of that was nothing. We're going to be discussing that right now on today's show. So I guess we'll start off with Ken and your thoughts on if that was something that ever occurred to you through the years, and if you think that, in fact, was the case that the Beatles did sort of brush George under the rug. When I say the Beatles, mainly John and Paul.
Well, I think George Harrison, like most human beings, is a complicated figure. Um, my opinions on this all come from the interviews that George has given and the other Beatles as well. And at times, George can be very bitter about the Beatle years. At times, he's very proud of it and he celebrates it. Sometimes he has a great sense of humor about it all, and sometimes he'll go off and say, well, I was limited to my two songs per album, and you have to wonder. Um, I I I personally think this is just in terms of songwriting. In the very beginning, George was not prolific at all, you know. Um, John and Paul were ahead of the game in that regard. They not only wrote songs on their own, they worked together on their own songs. George didn't really have that as much, although you will hear that, the others helped him. John helped write a few words in Taxman. George will also say that he helped John out with some of his songs. But when 1965 came around, he started getting two songs per album, and then he got better and better. And so I kind of feel like the last few years of the Beatles, when you hear about the other songs that George wrote, like Not Guilty or Circles or Sour Milk Sea, those songs, a lot of them, I think they were very good, and they could have been included on Beatles albums. But in the very beginning, I don't think he was treated unfairly. But at the same time, one thing that Mark Lewison brought to light in Tune In, which I had never known before, was that there was a moment, might have been a brief moment, when John and Paul considered making George their songwriting partner, and it would be a three-way thing. Lennon, McCartney, Harrison. Just imagine how different Beatles history would be if they stuck to that. And George might have contributed more as a songwriter to their songs. But I personally think that when it comes to the songwriting part, well, there was good reason why John and Paul didn't give George more songs. Um, I think that they felt that they were the team that led the Beatles and they would let George have a few songs here and there. And George made fantastic contributions with his songwriting. No doubt about it. And he blossomed as a songwriter, especially towards the end. And I shouldn't even say towards the end. Within You Without You is such a masterpiece. How he absorbed, Indian music and was able to write a song that complicated. And even John and Paul admitted that they weren't that fair to George. George Martin admitted that too. I think I brought up one time on this show that there was a quote from George Martin that he said, the first time he realized that George gave us a great song was Here Comes the Sun. Huh. Okay. What about While My Guitar Gently
Yeah,
Weeps? What
yeah.
about Within You Without You, which I think in recent years has finally been getting its due. I'm so glad it ended up on the new Blue compilation. What about Taxman? There's so many great songs. It's all too much. If I needed someone, I need you. I love Don't Bother Me. I love the whole
Mhm.
all the songs that George gave, but you know, they weren't pouring out of him like they were with John and Paul. But towards the end of the Beatles, it was a different story, and he was coming up with great material, including songs that ended up on All Things Must Pass. So he was really coming into his own as a songwriter. And maybe at that time, they could have given him more songs. I mean, I think Paul said, or John, one of the either John or Paul said that something might have been the best song on Abbey Road. So, and they rarely ever gave George that much credit
Yeah.
publicly. So, my thought is that George was proud of his accomplishments with the Beatles. He loved being in the band, but he was held back. And you know, it's a very interesting topic because whenever I read what people have to say online about it, there are some fans who think, oh, George is always complaining, he's always griping all the time. He should be grateful that he was in the Beatles. If it wasn't for the Beatles, he wouldn't have been famous. He wouldn't have had the chance to have the solo career that he did. So I understand that point of view, but I think the Beatles were very lucky to have him, not only as a songwriter, but for what he contributed as a guitar player and with the Indian music as well. So that's part of my thoughts on this, mainly as a songwriter.
So do you want to pause it there as a
Yeah,
songwriter?
we can come back
I
and
agree with everything you said. It's funny that um, I should know this. When we were talking the early years, 63, definitely by 64, 65, how much was George actually writing that was even coming into the recording studio? Do you believe he was writing and actually not even bringing some of his songs in? Or was his output what we heard, period? You know what I mean? Do we know? Was George kind of holding songs back early on and then started to get a little more confident? Um,
That's something I think we don't know.
we don't know.
You know,
You
because
know,
because he was also a little insecure about it early on. When you look in his I Me Mine and he talks about Don't Bother Me, his first
hmm,
song, for the Beatles, not counting half of Cry for a Shadow
hmm,
and In Spite of All the Danger. Um, he talks about whether, it might not be a very good song. It might not even be a song at all. I don't know what that's supposed to mean because it's quite obviously a song.
hmm.
And it's not a bad song, you know.
I think it's a great song, great first shot,
Yeah.
I
first go at it, rather.
And he may well have been doing other things that weren't brought into the studio because he was intimidated or he um, or brought them in and they didn't get passed, and he, for various reasons, didn't include them in I Me Mine. Basically, I Me Mine is the way we only way we can really look into his creative output, completely because. He compiled all of those things that he'd kept over the years, and maybe he didn't keep some, or maybe he didn't want to include some. Um, you know what to do. The outtake that was on the anthology. I mean, I kind of think that if they had done some work on that, it could have been an okay song. It wasn't horrible. It wasn't. I mean, if we're talking about second drawer songs, if you've got trouble, is a bit worse than that. I mean, so I think if they had done some effort. And that was another of his complaints in a way that they didn't devote a lot of effort to his songs when they did them. Now, whether that's a fair complaint, it's certainly a fair complaint later on because on the White Album songs that he did, John, I don't think even appeared for those sessions. So I think he can complain that his work was given short shrift. But there's a lot of, I mean, apart from we've got like two strands of things going on here. One is, what he actually did that we may or may not know about, and the other is, there's sort of like a psychological component to this. You know, beyond what he was writing and what he was bringing in, there's the sense that he got into the Beatles as the youngest of them and was treated as the youngest of them for a lot of the time. And you even get a little sense of that sort of towards the end, that he's still the little brother, And he outgrew that himself. He wanted to be seen as an equal as he began writing and bringing things in more. When I say aggressively, I don't mean, you know, aggressively. I mean, he's bringing them in, which he may not have been doing before. And feeling that, this deserves some consideration. Um, but we see a little bit in Let It Be too, when he brings in "I Me Mine," and he says, I don't know if you don't want my song in your movie, I don't care. So yeah, there's a lot of complicated interpersonal stuff going on that's sort of hard for anyone who's not one of those four to get to
Yeah.
the bottom of.
Do you think, I just want to ask you, Alan, in Let It Be, when John and Yoko are dancing to I Me Mine, you think that was kind of cutting down the song or making fun of it, or they were just, they felt like doing that in the moment?
It seemed to me just like what something they were doing at the moment. I mean, keep in mind the Beatles, going way back in their DNA, were a dance band,
Hmm.
and to have a new song that people want to dance to before it's even really recorded, that's something. I didn't take it as a diss at all. I
Okay.
pretty much the opposite in a way.
Yeah, I didn't either. Um, I think the argument about whether George was getting the short end of the stick picks up, of course, later in the 60s when we know George was writing more. Um, and, and a common complaint that some might have about the White Album was that things like Wild Honey Pie and Revolution 9 and maybe Good Night and maybe Why Don't We Do It in the Road could have opened up space for more of George's songs in that on that album. But the fact that they would John and Paul would come up with these songs and it was almost like they're on. There was no debate. They're on. Maybe there was a little bit with Revolution 9. The others were kind of saying, I don't know. But those songs went on, and it was almost like, I don't know if this is true. The impression I get was that George was never, hey, you have anything else? Because we could drop Wild Honey
Well,
Pie for,
not guilty. They did
right, yeah.
for two takes of.
But I mean, I like Not Guilty. I know a lot of people aren't crazy for it. I think it's a great song. I find it hard to believe that they thought Wild Honey Pie and Why Don't We Do It in the Road? Take those two off and replace them with a finished version of Not Guilty. Would you say that maybe the album improved a little bit, possibly? So the
Well,
fact, I mean, that's open for debate and opinion. But the fact that that didn't happen to me is the indications where, yeah, George was being distant so much that he probably wasn't in, he wasn't being. You have a fifth song to go with the four that are here because we have a few like thin spots. No, didn't end up happening that way. And then, in fact, with all of the songs, granted short songs on Abbey Road and unfinished songs that were linked together and created the medley, they might have been two of the strongest songs the Beatles ever did, but there probably could have been a third Harrison song squeaking into Abbey Road in place of Maxwell Silverhammer, maybe part of the medley.
Mhm. You know,
So that's where I think that, yeah, he was sort of being just kind of brushed aside, not even considered. Yeah, you're here. Oh, right. Okay. We forget, early on, I mean, they were the guys, John and Paul were the guys writing songs, and they came up with the goods. It's kind of like a thing like with Pink Floyd, the same thing. I mean, I know that Roger Waters is a lightning rod for a lot of folks, but when Sid Barrett stepped out of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters kind of quickly started filling that void of songwriting. And it got to the point where he was coming up with the concepts. There wasn't a lot of room for input but it wasn't like David Gilmour and Richard Wright and Nick Mason were coming up with quantity to be put in there. So the stage was set for Waters to dominate the band. And in the Beatles from the beginning, I mean, most bands would be thankful of one songwriter. They had two. George didn't stand a chance in the early years. And in that regard, um, chipping in was going to be near impossible to do. But looking back now at how the end came, um, and especially that comment that McCartney made in that meeting in '69 when he said, well, up until now, your songs weren't very good to begin with. That meant he just poo-pooed on uh, While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Taxman and um, Within You, Without You, the ones that Ken pointed out.
Hmm.
Um, I think that statement that Paul made, where your songs weren't really good up until now, is telling uh, to support the fact that at the end, at least, George was was being dissed, was kind of being marginalized in the band. And who knows if that how that would have changed, because John did have an option, did have an idea
Hmm.
of that album that never was to be, where there would be four John, four Paul, four George songs and a couple from Ringo.
Well, it proved that John recognized there was a problem there, and you had to give George, more time on their
Mhm.
albums. But one thing I don't know if we're ever gonna get to the bottom of, we can all guess about this, is that when you're looking at a song like Not Guilty, and the Beatles tried many takes at Not Guilty, okay? Maybe the others didn't think that much of it. Maybe George wasn't happy with the results of Not Guilty. He also wrote Circles at that time, although I only know of the demo that's on the White Album demos. You know, maybe the others didn't think highly of it. Maybe George wasn't happy with it. Um, so it's the same thing with All Things Must Pass, and there's been a lot of discussion about that song, that the Beatles spent a lot of time working on it, and so the decision as to whether or not they were going to include it on a Beatles album, um, they put the effort in, but maybe they didn't feel that the recordings gelled well enough. Maybe George didn't think that it worked as well as a band, so he kept it for himself. So we don't know behind the scenes with every single song whether or not, the other Beatles didn't want it or George wasn't happy with it, you know?
Or was George at the end kind of fed up with the situation and wasn't bringing anything to the table at the bitter end, and keeping everything he was writing for himself with the plan of putting out a solo album, and then the band broke up, and it was
Well,
a
but
good
if
thing
you
he
look at,
had this.
after the big blowout where he quit and then they went to Apple to record, he worked on For You Blue with them. He worked on Old Brown Shoe with them. So I don't think he just sort of threw up his hands and didn't want to bother. Don't know what happened to All Things Must Pass. I mean, they spent as much time on All Things Must Pass
Hmm.
as they did on Maxwell's Silver Hammer at those sessions, which, took up a lot of Let It Be too before Abbey Road. And, because, we know his complaints about how he's not given the same amount of time. So I added up all the amount of time spent on those two songs, because Maxwell being such a lightning rod and All Things Must Pass just not happening. I don't remember running into any of the dialogue between songs during the Let It Be sessions where they say, "Yeah, let's not bother with this one." It just disappeared. You know. So, maybe he decided that he would keep that one for his own projects. He also was working on something at the time, a lot of stuff. One thing that interests me, that Ken brought up was this idea of John and Paul considering making him a partner early on. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe they should have. maybe their deal should have been that all four of them had credit because basically they all contributed to those songs, including Ringo, and Ringo's contributions are not incidental. We don't really think of them as the same because they're drums, and they don't have, notes and themes and all of the things that the guitar and keyboard stuff does. But if you listen to his drum parts, they're really incredible, and as it gets into the late Beatle period, they're really orchestrated, and okay, it's intuitive, but so what, I kind of think that making it John and Paul as the writers and Ringo and George as, also in the band, kind of created a two-tier Beatles system financially for them. I mean, Ringo and George were never in quite as great shape as John and Paul were because they were getting the songwriting royalties, and those songwriting royalties were considerable. I think it might have been better if they shared it all. Um, and it might have encouraged George to contribute a bit more, even though because even though, we've got John and Paul, we kind of know which were John's and which were Paul's and which were both, and we would have known which were George's. And the other thing about this is, something that I've brought up at least a couple of times before, which is that George's contributions a lot of the time, while we think of them as arrangements, and I'm thinking, of course, of And I Love Her,
Hmm.
were really so intrinsic to the song that, you know, they should be considered composition as well, you know. So I feel that in a way, if I were going to rewrite, do one of these sort of sci-fi go back and change things kind of thing, I'd have had them decide to all have the writer credits like some bands do,
Yeah.
you know.
It's interesting to note that the Traveling Wilburys did that.
Hmm.
If you look at all the Traveling Wilburys songs, the songwriting credits go to the Traveling Wilburys,
Right.
not George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty. It's all the Traveling Wilburys.
Mhm.
So they all share equally in the songwriting.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of bands did that, and it probably makes a certain amount of sense for various reasons I've just mentioned.
Yeah. So,
I wonder if George really felt marginalized as we're talking, and that helped fuel his overall feeling towards being a pop star and how he would go through lulls in his solo career where it seemed like he also it was not a priority to him to get the best possible album out there, and yet his albums were all very strong. And so that's like a testament to his talent that here he is. He's not probably not even pushing 100% and still coming out with the goods. But you wonder if his experience in the 60s with the Beatles may have fueled his outlook towards the industry as a whole and towards fame in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the rest of his life. Um, because he was in a great situation with the Beatles, obviously, and there wasn't at the beginning any place for a third person to wiggle his way in. Um, and then at the end, when there was the goods were there, when George had the goods, I mean, hey, it's tough to kind of break through. And John and Paul are like, this is how we do things, right? This is it, normal. So I wonder if George had a little carryover that he took with him into his post-Beatle years that kind of soured him on the whole, you know,
Yeah,
music thing.
that was probably part of it, but also another part of it is that he sort of evolved in a different direction in his life.
Mhm.
He became fascinated with the religious stuff, and that to him was more important than being a pop star.
Yeah,
And he
true.
wanted to use being a pop star to get that message out, but being a pop star was not the be all and end all for him.
Right.
Uh, it was sort of a means to an end. And any number of interviews where he's kind of just sour on the business and the whole, even the history of the Beatles, the fact that the fans were sort of boxing them into this claustrophobic situation where they'd get off stage and they'd be in a truck and then they'd be in a hotel room and then, they couldn't do anything. That had to have been, to us, it seems really glamorous and, cool, but to them, it had to have been like, come on, this is like being in prison. I
Mhm.
think John and George at least have used that imagery.
Mhm.
Paul less so, Paul psychologically has a different makeup than George certainly, and also John. Paul likes the idea of being a pop star, but Paul has the luxury of liking being a pop star because he can also deliver what Darren called the goods. He can deliver some, interesting, not just pop star kind of stuff. I mean, if you consider his classical stuff, his fireman stuff, his other experimental stuff, and the fact that a lot of his songs are so much better than just, radio geared pop music, that, he was able to have it both ways.
Mhm.
John and George maybe less so, you know. And Ringo, it's funny when you listen to Ringo, like Ringo doesn't feel that he was given short shrift at all because he only wrote 2 songs as a Beatle. He's written a lot since. But he didn't feel like that was something he needed to push himself to do. And he often would say in interviews, well, the writers, meaning, John and Paul,
Mhm.
when you've got people that strong, you just are doing what they're doing. So he accepted that totally, and George didn't.
But Ringo wanted to be given credit for his drumming, and for so long he wasn't recognized as a great drummer.
That's right.
It's more in recent years that people have heard what he really played,
Mhm.
with Beatles recordings being clearer to listen to, and you can really hear the parts sometimes.
Yeah. And another thing about George is that, it wasn't just maybe the fact that we as an audience sort of could pick up that he was a sort of second class citizen within the Beatles, to John and Paul, even though obviously no one ever said such a thing. But, as fans, I remember when the albums used to come out. I liked George's earlier pop stuff, but when Within You Without You came out and the Indian things on Revolver, I really couldn't deal with it. I didn't. It was not music I understood, and Within You Without You was really long, and I just didn't like them, and none of my friends liked them. I feel like I shouldn't even admit this now because now I think Within You Without You is absolutely brilliant. But when they came out in the 60s, the audience was still also geared to the Beatles as a pop group, even though they were moving ahead of us to do something else. We were still apprehending it that way and didn't understand why something like Within You Without You would be on the album. I'm really glad it is, you know.
You know, Love You Too, to me is one of the more far out mid-period Beatles songs on Revolver. Um, and here was George with his small contributions to each album. Really, I mean, that and Tomorrow Never Knows are two extremely cutting edge songs from 1966. Um, and I'm sure that the people who, when they listened to Revolver for the first time, were taken by how weird Tomorrow Never Knows was and how weird Love You Too was.
Mhm.
And yet, there's George, being allowed to contribute something that was kind of against the grain, which then would question that would actually say, well, if he was being marginalized, we definitely wouldn't let him put a song on the album that pushed the envelope a bit
Mhm.
because George had the chance and he pushed the envelope on Revolver. Um, but then why wasn't he allowed to, expand beyond Within You, Without You, and Sergeant Pepper, unless he didn't have, didn't have the songs. But
Well, you know that
to contradict the whole marginalized concept in '66, George was came up with these cutting edge songs. They made it on the album.
that's an excellent point. But you know, George did offer only a Northern song first for Sergeant Pepper,
Right.
and George Martin said, "You can do better than this."
Mm.
So, on the one hand, because of that, we got this brilliant recording with Within You, Without You, an amazing song. But it's also insulting to,
Yeah.
to George that George Martin thought that way.
But that's a producer's job.
Right. You're
Did
right.
he tell how often did he say that to Paul and to John when they came with something that was in his to his ears was less than what they were capable of doing?
He may have. We don't know. But so he didn't get only a Northern Song onto Pepper, but it went on to Yellow Submarine. And on Yellow Submarine, I think there were only four new songs, and two of them were George's.
Two of them were George's, yeah.
And I really like It's All Too Much.
Yep.
I wish they hadn't edited it, because there are a couple of different edits out there, and I think it's a really great song, and there are some great covers of it actually. Steve Hillage, who used to be in
Yep.
Old Gong, um, that's a really good cover of it. And
And you know who did a really good cover? Journey.
Journey.
Journey did it on, I think, their third album, one of the early ones before Steve Perry joined, when it was still sort of a kind of a prog band trying to find their way. And I think it's on Look Into the Future, that album.
Hmm.
And it's really, really good. In fact, back when I was on WFUV, which I'm not any longer, I often play those two songs together, those two covers, going way back, those two, because they sounded really good together.
Hmm.
And it always struck me that it's kind of like a deep, kind of digging deep to find a Beatle tune to cover, and yet so many people did do it, did cover that song.
Hmm.
And you know,
And
it's all too much for me anyway. It's kind of like a precursor to All You Need Is Love. It's got this universal theme of love in it,
Yeah, yeah,
and it has that psychedelic feel to it. And It's All Too Much was really recorded before All You Need Is Love. It
Hmm.
was recorded before Sergeant Pepper was released.
Hmm.
that's right. Yeah,
And really, for all we hear about, uh, I Feel Fine having feedback at the beginning, um, all too much is like
yeah,
10 times as much feedback, and the sort of high wailing feedback that came into use later in the sort of Hendrix years. It's a lot more adventurous in a way. It's a pretty
yeah.
adventurous song, really.
It's all too much. Journey was on his second album, Look Into the Future, 1976.
Hmm.
So,
You know, you were talking before, Darren, about like the trappings of the fame, and I think all four Beatles have struggled in their solo careers of dealing with how enormous the Beatles were and how they even grow in legend with every passing year. And, you know, we've talked many times, especially you and I, Darren, how the Beatles are the only band where each individual member has had commercial success with singles and albums. And that's something to really, I think, when you're telling the Beatles story, that should be emphasized.
yeah,
But no matter how much success they've had on their own, There's so many people in this world that will only think of them or mainly think of them as being Beatles. They will always be Beatles first. And if you think of George in the image that what he was in the Beatles, he still was under John and Paul as a songwriter. And maybe many people in the world don't think as highly of him as a songwriter for that very reason. He had a lot of success on his own. All Things Must Pass, the Bangladesh concert, Living in the Material World was a number one album. Big comeback with Cloud Nine, the Traveling Wilburys, all of that. There isn't anybody on this planet that wouldn't kill to have had the careers that any of the four of them had on their own. And yet, when you're always thought of as a Beatle first, I think that George at times resented that. And I'm sure the other Beatles felt that way too. Less so with Paul and Ringo. But, when you're constantly fed the question, when are you getting back together? Like everything still revolves around that in an interview. We can talk about the new album, but you're still a Beatle.
Right.
How do you deal with that? How does anyone deal with that? When you know that your past is always going to be looked upon as something that will be bigger than whatever you're doing right now.
Yeah. I mean, till this day, there a lot of times former Beatle Paul McCartney,
Yep.
former Beatle Ringo Starr. Yeah.
It's like you could have erased the last 55 years and what happened. It's
Paul and
it's
Ringo have
astounding
come
how
Paul and
much
Ringo have come to terms with it, though. You hear the little promos they do for Sirius XM, Beatles channel, and not to mention what they do in their stage sets. Particularly Paul. Um, so I think excuse me, I think they've sort of belatedly taken ownership of that. Um, and it's a pity that John and George didn't, live to this point where they might have as well. They might have taken ownership of it as well, and then they might have gotten back together for just
Yeah.
for some thing, like the couple of singles, "Free as a Bird," etc. Like, what if they had decided to do that when John and George, if John and George had lived?
Hmm.
Like they were putting together the anthology, maybe they would have said, let's do a track,
well, the thought was before it became the anthology, when it was the Long and Winding Road, it was
right,
first called that they might do some incidental music for it.
right,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, Paul used to say that, and then that was around the same time that George used to say, well, the Beatles will never get back together while John Lennon remains dead, that kind of thing. So, um, and about that, Paul once said to me in an interview, but after the interview was done, I mentioned that, George saying that, and he said, yes, well, that was during George's sour period, and he paused for like 2 seconds and said, George's sour period's been going on for quite a long time.
That's funny. All right. So, any final thoughts? Any maybe some beginning thoughts here at the end?
Um, I think a lot should be said about George's ability as a guitar player and what he brought to the Beatles for his guitar playing.
Hmm.
One of the
Yeah,
great things,
that I think is not acknowledged much.
yeah, one of the good things about living today is how, with today's technology, you can isolate tracks and you can hear individual contributions that each of the Beatles have made. You can find a lot of that online. And if you just listen to George's parts on Beatles songs, there's a lot of stuff that you didn't realize was going on.
Hmm.
It's so easy to get wrapped up in the song. You might
Right.
be singing along with it. You're not really paying attention to every little detail, but he really filled in the spaces and accentuated the guitar where it was needed, knew when to play, when not to play. Same thing with Ringo and his drumming. And There are things that it's so easy to overlook.
Mhm.
Despite hearing this music year after year after year, you hear new things especially when the tracks are isolated.
Right, right. That's why I think that they should all have writer credit, because George's guitar, excuse me, George's guitar playing, you know, there are a couple of different schools of rock lead guitarists, I mean, there are the guys who are just, out there doing gigantic solos. George was more of a focus on all the details kind of guy. So there might be a solo and it might not be that long, but it's always really well crafted, and the stuff beyond the solo, which is what I think Ken is
Hmm.
talking about, all those little details. You listen to the guitar track to All My Lovin', and there's that cool little chordal solo in the middle, but all through it, there were these, little, you know, he's adding accenting that you're not necessarily noticing, but you'd notice it if it was gone. You know, it's really an important part of it. So yeah, that was another big contribution of his, and he
Mhm.
gets dissed a lot because I don't know, in the Let It Be outtake, sometimes he's sort of, noodling around and it's not that focused. And of course, Paul playing the solo on Taxman, stuff like that is given people ammunition to sort of diss George's guitar playing, but I think that's not looking at it the right way. I mean, what we hear during the Get Back Let It Be sessions, that wasn't really for us to hear. That's the workshop. And by the time those songs were finished, his guitar parts were exactly what they needed to be. So, I think we should just consider ourselves sort of lucky in getting to hear the workshop rather than like, oh man, why is he so waffly,
George was the type of musician, and all four Beatles were that way,
Hmm.
where they don't try to overdo, they don't try to be the star of the song. It's not all me, me, me. Everybody contributes what's necessary.
Hmm.
And George, you can't compare him to a Jimi Hendrix, someone or a guitar player that really does long guitar solos. That's not his style.
Yeah.
He played what was necessary for the song and didn't overdo it. Same thing, especially, that's what we've been saying a lot about Ringo.
Yeah.
Ringo doesn't get the credit that he deserves, but he plays the parts that are needed. He also doesn't play. He leaves space at certain parts of the song. And that's just as important as what you play. So, as four musicians who knew how to complement each other, you couldn't get much better than the Beatles in that regard. No one really tried to outdo each other as musicians.
That's a good point. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess um that's a wrap on that. Now we're going to do a show soon on how I feel like Alan and Ken monopolized this show, and and all anyway. So yeah, let's go around the room and put a wrap on things. And what do you got to close out with, Alan?
Okay. You can get in touch with me on Facebook at Allan Kozinn or Allan Kozinn Remixed. You can write to all of us here on Things We Said Today at Things We Said Today Radio Show at gmail.com. And you can follow us on Twitter at Things We Said Fab and on BlueSky at Things We Said Today. And of course, we have our Facebook page, Things We Said Today video podcast, where we post links to the shows and various other stuff that occurs to us in between shows. So that's pretty much that.
All right, Ken.
You can always email me at everylittlething@att.net. You can ask me any questions you like about the Beatles. Tell me what you think about this show. Have ideas for this show, which you can also write into at the things we said today, radioshow@gmail.com, email as well. Or if you want to write to me about Talk More Talk, my other podcast there with Darren and Kid O'Toole, feel free to. Every little thing at att.net. On Ken Michaels Radio, my own YouTube channel, I did two new shows, one of which was with Bill Last. Bill is the author of this brand new book, The Beatles Collected Videography, a guide to collecting group and solo video from 1962 to 2024. This is pretty much everything that exists on video of the Beatles group and solo. Doesn't mean that it's all something that's been released, especially when it comes to videos, all the Beatles videos, all the solo videos. It's all covered in here. It's all a list pretty much with a brief description on some of them. But for example, if you're just getting into collecting all this stuff and you want to hunt down all the stuff that exists on video and you want to know how many videos were made for, we can work it out. You can find out here and what the differences are. Okay. And Bill Last was a guest on Ken Michaels Radio. I also just did my second Beatles Preferences show. This is a fun idea that I came up with where I asked my guests to pick between two, sometimes more, songs or albums of which they prefer to listen to. The very first show I did on this was with everyone from Things We Said Today, with Allan and Darren and Al Sussman and Steve Marinucci. Steve and I started the show together. Al came along, and now it's just the three of us here. But I grouped all five of us together on this, and so I might say something like Paperback Writer or Rain. Which song do you prefer to listen to? And they all come up with their choices, and they all discuss why. So it's a real fun idea. And the most recent show that I did on this, we had other guests on, all authors from the UK. So we had Ken McNabb on, who wrote the book And in the End, The Last Days of the Beatles. We had Adrian Sinclair on, and that was Allan's partner there on the McCartney Legacy series. And we had David Bedford, who's written many books now on the Beatles, most known for Liddy Pool, Birthplace of the Beatles, also the Fab 104. And do I have it here? I hope I do somewhere. Here it is. His latest book called What If. This all has to do with certain circumstances of what happened in Beatle history. What if they didn't happen? Bit by bit. What if John and Paul never met each other? What would have happened? What if George Martin wasn't the producer for the Beatles? What if Brian Epstein didn't become their manager? What if Parlophone didn't sign them? Things like that. What if Pete Best stayed in the Beatles? You know, a lot of this is just fun and conjecturing, but that's his latest book, The Beatles What If from David Bedford. I'm hoping to have him on my channel just to discuss that book. And also on Talk More Talk, the other Kid O'Toole. Ah, there I go again.
Good work.
Okay,
I
someone's
like
at
the
the
way I like
signal.
the color, the orange hue you come back as.
Okay, that's a
On
little
my
putting a little bit of the Mets in there just for you.
oh, don't mention not. And he's gone again. So
All right.
hopefully, he's back and he's orange and he's gone.
They're not
Um,
keeping me on here.
uh,
All right,
you
here
get
we
one more chance.
Okay. Talk
Uh,
More Talk. We just did a
yes,
show on the top three solo Beatle years
right.
collectively. So, what did we each feel were the best 3 years in the solo careers of the Beatles when you look at their output or their activities of the year? That's a Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast, and that's on every audio platform. And we have our own YouTube channel as well. And then there's my website, kenmichaelsradio.com, with Beatles trivia on there. Always contests in which you can win great prizes like books, CDs, DVDs, you name it. That's at kenmichaelsradio.com, the Beatles trivia and games page. Lots of interviews as well on the website. And then there's Every Little Thing, my radio show, which airs on somewhere around 50 radio stations. But the easiest way to listen to it, and you can listen to it any time of the day, is on WFDU's website, WFDU.FM. Go to their archives page and type in Every Little Thing, and you will get the last 2 weeks worth of shows. The show does air live Saturday mornings at 6 a.m. and Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. And those shows then go right to the archives. So you actually have 4 shows there you can listen to, and each show is on the website for 2 weeks. Okay? That's WFDU.FM. And I think that's it for
All
now.
right. And just to briefly reiterate what I said at the top of the show, unfortunately, and I don't mean to make light of it or seem like matter of fact, it definitely was a major life change for me when I was let go at WFUV due to the lack of government funding for public broadcasting. Those cuts were made, and I had no idea it was going to come, and then I was going to get cut. But so at the moment, kind of in limbo, but there is some stuff cooking, and hopefully I'll have in the weeks and months to come some new places to go and play music and talk about music and whatnot, besides here and Talk More Talk. So in the meantime, I'm still on Facebook, 2 pages. Come like either one of them. One is just Darren DeVivo. The other one is Darren DeVivo. And I changed the name of it now. I couldn't remember the name before. You think I'm going to remember it now? But if you do a search on Facebook, you're bound to stumble upon one or both of them. And hook up there, and I'm always trying to put some interesting content on those pages, and I'll of course share uh, what the future is going to bring, or what the future might have in store for me, is what I should say now, and as we move towards the end of 2025. So, and I want to thank those who did reach out to me because I've got bombarded with well wishes, and if any of you happen to chime in on Facebook, I appreciate it. Gradually, I'm sifting through all of those comments. There's a lot of them on Facebook that have shown me support in this tough time. But
Darren,
anyway,
I
yes.
just wanted to say that here on Things We Said Today and Talk More Talk, you have your fans here, and they're going to be right by your side with
Oh, thank
whatever
you. I
decision
appreciate
that
it.
you're making. You're not losing them. They're
No,
sticking
good.
by you,
Well, that,
no matter what.
believe me, it means a lot, and thank goodness for this show, and thank goodness for Talk More Talk, because especially right now where I'm in a little bit of a state of limbo, I know I have these shows happening just about every week for the most part. We're recording something, so anyway, thanks a lot. I appreciate it, and the 2 Facebook pages for me, and that's about it for things we said today. For Allan Kozinn and for Ken Michaels, I'm Darren DeVivo. Again, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.